Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and this is my early review, my first 10 hours of my experience with Armoredcore 6, Fires of Rubicon. Is it worth the buy? How good is it? And what is it like? For this video and quick review, we're going to take on a couple different missions. We're going to take on a boss at the end. I'm going to show you an early game build that can help you with the Chapter 1 final boss because he can be on the tougher side, and I'm going to go over the details of what the gameplay is like and how the game is as a whole. First of all, Armoredcore 6 can run at 120 frames per second, which is pretty incredible, although they are having some issues with HDR on PC where it's dim, like the actual screen is dim. You can fix it by turning HDR off. I'm sure that'll be fixed in a future patch. However, the game can run at 120 FPS, which is pretty incredible. It's a very good looking mech shooter. Now for combat, you get missions. This isn't an open world game, it's a very linear experience. Every mission that you're on has barriers that you can't go past. Each individual mission though is really well paced. I do like the mission format, it's very fitting for this type of game. Speaking of that, as far as the missions go themselves, a lot of times you'll have like 3 or 4 missions at a time and you'll get to choose how to go about them, although you do have to complete them all to move on. The game is split up into chapters. I believe there's a total of 5 chapters and a lot of missions across those chapters. As far as the actual gameplay goes, this isn't really a Souls game, but this is very much Sekiro with mechs. Now, you can build up posture on bosses. I'm going to talk about the bosses a little bit more later on. As far as the boss fights though, they're very difficult. The game plays more like Sekiro in the sense of how hard the bosses are and how hard the regular enemies you come across are. And that could be mini bosses like other mechs that are basically like yourself, where you're going to have to posture break them and they're going to have an arsenal of weapons and things that they can hit you with to destroy you quickly, so you're going to have to change builds kind of on the fly from time to time. Mini bosses can be a challenge, and the regular game bosses are extremely tough in Armoredcore 6. With that being said, there's a little bit too much of a difference between your regular mission and a boss fight. The boss fights are extremely tough, but the regular missions can be on the easier side. There's a huge gap in difficulty between your regular missions and the boss fights in the game. With that being said, I don't want to spoil too much, but the Chapter 1 boss is very much a skill check. There's a boss at the end of each chapter. I guess so far I'm at the end of Chapter 3 at this point. But the end of Chapter 1 is an incredibly difficult finale where you definitely get skill checked, and it's not very jump into this franchise for the first time friendly. It's an extremely hard boss that will likely test the patience of some new players. Yeah, after this mission we're going to go over a couple different things. I am going to show, as I mentioned, an early game build that might be able to help you out with that first boss that I talked about. But yeah, this is definitely going to be a skill check. It leans more towards Sekiro in terms of difficulty. I feel like posture breaking wasn't really necessary in a mech game, and it does have some parts of it that are a little bit confusing. And what do I mean by that? I mean that fact that every boss fight so far, I feel like I've had to change my build entirely up for each individual boss instead of having a build that's viable throughout the entire game. And then you're stuck most of the time working on that posture meter bar, kind of like you are in Sekiro, but it's a mech game, so it kind of feels awkward at times. That being said, the game's really fun. If you're into a mech shooter, this is something that can be really fun. By the way, I'm going to show a build on screen. This is an excellent build for the first Chapter 1 boss fight, which can be very difficult. Basically, you can use these 2 laser cannons in combination with the ability to tank the first chapter boss, and you can take a lot of damage off them with these laser cannons. You're very limited in what you get in the first chapter, but you do have everything here, and you can destroy the first chapter boss with a build and setup like this. You will find yourself changing your build frequently for the tough boss fights in the game, but as far as the tough boss fights go, it does come around to having the right build and setup. If you do build around the right build, you will find the bosses to be a little bit easier. That said, I don't like the fact that one build isn't entirely necessarily viable for most players through the whole game. And you're going to see me end up getting killed here. I wanted to show one of the challenging mini-boss fights. This was a really challenging one for me. It took more than a few tries to get this guy down, but it gives you an example of how the difficulty is in the game. Having to build that posture meter, having enemies that constantly spam and attack you, and having them be on the tankier side as well. Yeah, this is definitely one of the tougher mini-bosses in the game. There's several of these. This guy can hit you really hard. He can stun you frequently. Keep in mind, just like Sekiro, your posture can get broken yourself as well, so you have to be wary of that. You'll end up being a standing target. You have to break their posture to maximize the most damage. And the controls at times for a mech shooter does feel good, but it can absolutely feel clunky, so be aware of that. When you buy this game, you're going to have to get used to it. It's probably going to take you a couple hours to get used to the controls and how the tank and mech controls work, but once you do, they do feel really good. It's a solid mech shooter. But we knew obviously from Software that they were going to come up with a solid game, that the gameplay mechanics were going to be smooth, and that they were, and that the boss fights in the games themselves is going to be tough. We knew that it was going to be on the tougher side. However, I do still think that some of the boss fights and the difficulty curve in general is going to be a lot, especially for new players. This is not going to be one of those games where you jump into the game right away and you have a feel for the controls and you're immediately able to destroy some of the tougher bosses in the game if you haven't played Armoredcore before and if you're not familiar with From Software. It does take a little bit to get used to, but once you do, the controls feel really smooth and the control of the mech in general, while clunky at times, but again, it's a mech shooter, so that's going to happen. It does feel right for how the battles go. Everything feels good in terms of control and how you move your mech. And the missions can be really fun. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but the missions themselves are a really good time. I do enjoy the mission structure. It feels right for the type of game that it is. I think an open world would kind of been a little bit weird for a mech game. As far as the missions go, the structures are nice, but again, that difficulty curve going into a boss fight, knowing how it's going to be an entirely different game when you get there, is something that definitely is a little bit different to get used to. Now, the weapons you get are really cool. You get a lot of cool weapons in Armored Core. There's a ton of different variety in terms of build. There's definitely things that you can do. And by the way, I'm going to be using my second channel for builds, so definitely be sure to check that out. It's in the description below. However, I did mention this earlier for bosses. It does seem like they're pushing you towards an individual build for each boss, which is kind of in contrast to other games like Elden Ring, Dark Souls, where you can just use whatever build you like or have a couple of different weapons that can make it through the whole game. Armored Core tends to push you in a direction for each individual boss fight, and there's certain builds that just aren't going to work against certain bosses. Now, this boss here is just another boss that's kind of based off the first boss that you're ever going to run across, and that's not the Chapter 1 final boss, but the intro boss, which can be on the difficult side. But once you get to this one, he's fairly easy, lucky for me. Now it comes down to, will you have fun with Armored Core 6? Is Armored Core 6 going to be the right game for you? Well, if you like Sekiro a lot, if you're into mech shooters, then yes. But if you're just jumping into this game the first time and you think it's going to be on the easy side, it's definitely going to challenge you. It's going to feel a little bit clunky at times too, but overall it does amount to a very fun and enjoyable mech shooter. And you get to hop around and shoot things in a giant tall mech, which is really enjoyable too. You get to go around, blow up different things, and as I mentioned, there's a ton of different build variety here that you can use, a ton of different weapons you can put on your mech. You're up to you as far as customizing. You could also change the color on the mech, which is really cool too. I like the tankier setups. For me, the tank build has worked more so far to this point, and the dual Gatling guns can do a ton of damage. We have something on our back, by the way, that can do an intense amount of posture damage as well in these songbirds. Yeah, I have more of a boss type setup here where you can posture break with our back weapons, and then we can do all of the damage in the world with these Gatling guns. They do chew through HP rather quickly, and there's something that can definitely make some of the tougher fights a little bit more trivial. So if you're watching this, if you're enjoying as far as the actual footage goes, this is pretty much the game. You go on different missions. There's a few different chapters, 5 different chapters in total, a ton of different missions, a lot of build variety, and you basically shoot things, blow things up, and go on and face extremely tough bosses and opponents. Speaking of that, there's something called the Arena, which you can do, and that can upgrade your mech. It gives you additional upgrades that are basically passive upgrades, as well as PvP. Armored Core 6 does have PvP as well. I haven't gotten into that yet, but I've heard so far it's actually quite good. Those that know my channel know, though, I'm more of a PvE guy. I like the campaigns and stuff here, and I imagine once I finish this, it's going to go into a New Game Plus type of thing, where it's going to get more difficult and give you a reason to go back to. I've also heard the replayability on Armored Core 6 is good as well. Yeah, people have a lot of motivation to go back so far, from what I've heard, at least people that have beat the game, because there's several different endings, there's New Game Plus, and there's a lot you can do. As far as the replay value, you are getting good replay value with Armored Core 6. And this is actually one of the easier bosses here. I mentioned that as far as the boss goes, he's not too difficult. It's kind of the same boss that you end up fighting in the tutorial at the beginning of the game, just a harder version. But you can see he's on the tankier side, does take a lot of hits, and to do additional damage, you have to posture break. As you can see here, I use the songbirds to essentially break his posture. That's the whole thing here. Use them to break the posture, and then use the Gatling guns to inflict as much damage as I can as quickly as possible. Yeah, so the Gatling guns are really good. They actually go through enemies' HP very quickly, and it's a very good way to take on some of the tougher bosses and enemies in the game. Once you stun them, you could just heavy fire with them. Keep in mind, though, your weapons do overheat, so you have to pace yourself. That's another factor you always have to look out for, and obviously, you have to reload them as well. Yeah, the Gatling guns will overheat, and then the weapons on my back, you'll see me, they'll have a reload timer as we're reloading them, and then we get to use them again. And the ones on the back, the songbirds, are excellent for those posture breaks. They can really chew up that posture meter, and then we can go in and just do a ton of damage to whatever enemy we're facing with the Gatling guns afterwards. So how is Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon? If I were to give it a score, I thought about this for a while. I did come up with a final score, and there is a few things that I have to take points off for, at least 1 point or so, because it's not as user-friendly jumping into the franchise. And as far as the game itself goes, it's an excellent game. It plays really smoothly. It can run at 120 FPS. And all around, it's a great game, but I do not think it is excellent or perfect by any means. I wouldn't give it the 10 out of 10 that I gave Elden Ring. The overall score that I would give Armored Core is an 8.5 out of 10. It's definitely worth a buy.